Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and we are joined once again by Jeffrey Tucker, who I'm always happy to talk with because you're one of the original anarchists out here that it stays consistent. That's the most important part.
Yeah, I've not gone alt-right or SJW yet.
Oh, not libertarians for Trump? Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you today about, there's been recent news, and of course you've mentioned to me it's not completely recent news because this has happened before, but Elon Musk has announced that he's releasing the patents of Tesla for the market kind of decide. What do you think about this?
Well, I think it's wonderful, and it's an illustration of the fact that we need a free market and the network that it provides for companies to be profitable, which is kind of interesting because since the 18th century, since we first started seeing patents introduced first in the UK, eventually in the US, and that's a complicated history, the presumption was always that patents were good for business, and the reason is that they restrict competition. But then, to that exact same extent, they also slow down the development of industry. That's always been true. And there's all kind of reasons for it. Oh, well, you have to recoup the costs of R&D and blah, blah, blah. And none of which is really a good excuse for what's basically the creation of industrial monopoly. But in the case of Tesla, we're seeing an example of what happens. A monopoly on its technology is not good for Tesla. They need their technologies to become part of a general market order so that they don't have to become overly and unsustainably vertically integrated. They want to pursue horizontal integration, not integration, but cooperation in the name of their own profitability. So I think it's a great move. I wouldn't say it's a principled move, no, which is okay. But it just illustrates the downside of patents. And actually, so much of what's going on today in the world of enterprise is showing the problems with patents, actually. Even in software, open source models are generally outperforming extremely proprietary models, like you get in Apple. You can compare the success of the iPhone with Samsung and some of their more open source operating systems, and at the very least, the open source systems are competitive. Now, let me say another thing about this monopoly, this patent thing. A lot of companies don't see it as necessarily an option to not have patents because part of the culture of venture capital and even high-end finance is to look for companies to make sure they have a large patent war chest. The reason for such a large war chest is not so much to obtain a monopoly, but to prevent patent trolls from duplicating the same technology and then coming back at them later and saying, oh, look, you can't produce this. So to have a big moat around you built of legal privileges can sometimes be the only safe way to do business, and that's really tragic.
I find it interesting that you see people on the left and the right, they support patent laws and this kind of stuff that, for example, on the left especially, we got to stop these major monopolies, these big corporate monopolies, but then they support the same industry or the same branches of government that allow these things to become massive monopolies. And it's interesting considering Tesla, going back to actual Nikola Tesla and his competition in the market with Edison, who utilized the patent system very well to his advantage so that anyone who had any ideas or wanted to elaborate on any ideas didn't have an opportunity on the market to really develop them because, well, he kind of ran a cartel, if you will, that made sure that anyone that tried to compete against him was ran out of the market.
Oh, sure. That was true with the Wright brothers, too. With Eli Whitney and his stupid cotton gin. I mean, you can go back through the history of patents, but the funny thing is that it's not always benefited the enterprise. I mean, Eli Whitney ultimately went broke suing people for cotton gin that actually he didn't really invent. So there's a lot of mythologies around that. And the Wright brothers, yeah, they obtained a monopoly patent on the airplane, but only a few years later, within a decade, American plane technology was massively behind all other airplane technology in the world, precisely because of the slowdown in industrial development that was required by the patents itself. Patents have just been generally disastrous. And what's interesting, when you look back at the 18th century, classical liberals or champions of the free market were of both minds on the question, but there were plenty of people that were warning against patents, even in the 18th century, that this is inconsistent with the free market, and I obviously believe that it is. Just a quick case for why that is the case. There's no such thing as patents without legislation. I mean, you have to have the state, and you have to have laws. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any chance to enforce a so-called patent. You might be able to obtain an industrial monopoly on something just because you're really good at what you do, like Arm & Hammer baking soda or Clorox bleach. Okay, fine. But there's no legal restrictions for entry in that market. It's just nobody has the inspiration because they're doing a good job at making stupid baking soda. Okay, that's fine. But if you want to lock down the market forever and experience a sort of above average rate of return and profitability that's not dissipated through the competitive pressures as it always and everywhere is, you have to have that legal privilege.
And there's a lot of ways that obviously government stifles innovation. We know that. Obviously, competition runs most free and most productive on the market when the government isn't restricting, taxing, regulating. Of course, the taxes and the regulations push the small business out of the market, making the competition rather nearly impossible unless they have such a great product and have the right, marketing tools at their hand that they can actually get that idea out there. But we see a lot of people, they'll say, well, what about my music, for example, intellectual property? What if I write a song and someone steals it? They take that song and they...
That would never happen, surely.
And that's happening with the government, and I find it interesting that it's like, these are throat noises. Okay, you came up with an idea, but that idea isn't a physical thing. If you were to steal a car, for example, and a clone of that car remained there, were you really stealing the car? I mean, that's the argument I hear quite often when it comes to intellectual property, is that if it's still there, you aren't really stealing it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I could repeat everything you just said after you've left this interview, and I've stolen nothing from you. All I've done is duplicate your infinitely reproducible ideas. And that's what's the essence of the difference between the world of ideas and the world of physical property. One is scarce and one is not scarce. And all intellectual property legislation does is comes up with an artificial, really coercive way to scarcify what is ultimately an infinite good. And it's not actually successful. As we can see in the music industry, I mean, piracy has just been rampant for 20 years. And finally, the profitability systems that we have now for music distribution are relying on things like convenience of downloads and streaming services and these kinds of things. The market itself has found a way to make production of music profitable despite so-called rampant piracy. So you're never going to fully crack down on it. And let me say something about, there's so much to say about this topic, but you know that a lot of the U.S. trade dispute with China is revolving around this intellectual property issue. And I looked into this in great detail. The Chinese can't even fathom our system. I mean, they can't even understand, like, why do you have patents on software but not copyrights on cookbooks? Why is a sports play unpatented but a way to produce this particular kind of piece for the iPhone is patented? I mean, how come you can't patent perfume? But you can patent, other things. I mean, so
like a strain of a plant, for example, in the case of Bayer and Monsanto.
Yeah, exactly. So none of it makes any sense. It's all inconsistent. And so the U.S. is saying to China, adopt our system. And the Chinese are like, what system? I mean, to the extent that we can figure out your law, everybody's violating it anyway. Even the industries that rely most heavily on patents, they rely on them for venture capital and for impressing investors, but not really for development plans. I mean, it takes forever to obtain a patent, like 2 or 3 years or more, and by that time the market's already moved forward. So the whole system is like fundamentally screwed up. I think we're in a kind of a strange prisoner's dilemma with regard to this. Like even Bill Gates said in the old days that he would have been thrilled to have gotten rid of the patent system entirely. It's just so wasteful. But nobody is willing to be the first mover, to just issue patents entirely. And this is why the Tesla case is actually an interesting one.
And this is exactly what I wanted to come to at the end here is I find there are solutions. Obviously, most of us will know, the free market will, make the decision for us, the people, individual demand. But obviously, we don't have a very free market for sure. But a lot of people are talking about how the blockchain could come in handy for something like this. Like, for example, you could track a certain thing that is something that you've done not legally, but on the blockchain, decentralized, freely, track, for example, your music, track your ideas and where it's going. There might be even a profitability structure that can be built into that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. The blockchain specializes in establishing what's called provenance, which is the origin of a particular idea, and consumers might be willing to purchase, to traffic in goods that have well-established provenance rather than the pirated good. And actually, you see this every single day in real life. I mean, you go to the CVS, you got a splitting headache. There's Bayer aspirin, and there's a CVS brand aspirin. You're like, well, I know intellectually they're the same thing. The CVS version is a third less, but God, my head really hurts. I probably better trust Bayer. So that's a little bit of what we're talking about here. That is not the same thing as intellectual property. That's just developing a brand and a reputation, and surely provenance is part of that reputation, and blockchain technology can help establish that. You know, I'm all for anything that things that seem or look or feel like intellectual property, provided it's a market mechanism. I think as everywhere, the state has messed everything up.
Yeah, and of course it always comes down to individual responsibility too. That's the basis of it all, really. So if someone had the same name as you, for example, and was suddenly getting a great name for themselves, or became a serial killer or something like that, you just have to compete with your name like anything else.
You really raise an interesting point. I was just thinking as you said that there are many Jeffrey Tuckers on Twitter, and what can I do about that? It's just the way it's going to be. However, if there's somebody named Jeffrey Tucker who's actually using my picture and pretending to be me, then what am I going to do? Call the government? I mean, obviously Twitter has every incentive to take down those accounts because they want to retain my loyalty. So I think the market can handle things like even trademark. I think the market's very good at that, which is a completely different subject, but it's related.
Yeah. Well, and of course, it would suck to have the name Ted Bundy or something. When you see another person that has their name that does terrible things, you just have to do what you can with your name or change it. I don't know,
Theodore.
Yeah. Just finally, I just want to quickly get into something that I find very important. That there's not enough people talking about the solutions. Everyone complains about government, and rightly so. But I feel like with the blockchain technology that we've been talking about here, we can see, without the left or the right being convinced of anything, slowly a convenience adoption of a lot of these things, these alternatives to governments happening without them voting for it, without them supporting it. It'll just become more convenient, more realistic to use these alternatives, and it'll slowly be adopted.
Well, there's a reason for this, and the reason is the government is necessarily always backward looking. There's nothing progressive about government. Government doesn't anticipate the next thing. All it does is look at the past and try to regulate in light of that. And also it can't get rid of these regulations. We're still suffering under laws passed in the late 19th century and earlier, really over 500 years. So government's not a forward-looking institution, but markets are necessarily always forward-looking, trying to find the next thing, what's around the corner in this uncertain thing we call the trajectory of time. So if you're really going to have material progress, it's always going to rely on busting up and departing from the existing central plan, which is all the regulatory state really is.
Well, you write some of the best articles I've ever read. I think everyone needs to check out, if you haven't somehow already, Jeffrey Tucker at American Institute for Economic Research. I got the name right this time.
I just think the four most boring words in the English language.
But very interesting articles, so I hope everyone checks it out. Anywhere else anyone can check out your work?
No, it's a good place. Follow me on Twitter. I always like that.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Like what you see here, WAM? Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We can't do it without you. Any donation is very much appreciated, especially as we are so heavily demonetized and censored by YouTube, as these guys come in and flag all of our content as hate speech. The shadow banning is getting really bad, guys. Also, check our Bitcoin address right here on the screen or in the description below. We really appreciate it. And of course, check us out at the Red Pill Expo 2019. Of course, the great G. Edward Griffin and so many other incredible speakers will be there. Our link for that is below as well. And we cannot forget Mike Maloney's goldsilver.com, which you can also find in the description. One of the greatest market and monetary historians out there. We really encourage everyone to check that out. But until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.